Troy, movie review. So this is part of my scripted movie review series in which I go through my blog archives and kind of dig up movie reviews I've already done and try and make them into YouTube videos. This is about the movie on the Trojan War, Troy, that came out in 2004. Remember that movie? I actually got two posts out of this. I got a post in which I talked about my anticipations of the movie before it came out in theaters, and then I had another post kind of giving my immediate thoughts after I saw it in the theaters. I'll read both of them here. So the first one here, this is before I saw the movie. I had seen the previews in the movie theaters and I knew it was coming, but I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to contradict myself somewhat here, in that in this case, I am going to comment on a movie I haven't seen. I am also going to make a disclaimer that what follows probably deserves a geek alert. I'm eagerly awaiting, but somewhat worried about the upcoming Troy movie. Those of you who knew me in my youth, say around 7th or 8th grade, will recall that I went through a phase of great interest in the Trojan War. Anyone familiar with this ancient Greek legend knows the amount of literature produced on the Trojan War is overwhelming. Over half of all surviving ancient Greek literature is written about the Trojan War, and that's not even counting when you get into the Romans and all they wrote about the Trojan War. And then Shakespeare had a play about the Trojan War. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote a story about the Trojan War. All this stuff. How are you possibly going to cram it into a 2-hour movie? I shudder to think about it. I've always thought that the Trojan War would be very difficult to transfer into a movie. For one thing, the subject is much too vast for a 2-hour film. For another thing, it will be difficult for modern audiences, as there is no discernible good guy or bad guy. Sometimes you're supposed to feel sympathetic for the Greeks, other times you're supposed to feel sympathetic for the Trojans. Often it depends on who's telling the story. For example, the Romans thought they were descended from the Trojans, so in a Roman story like the Aeneid, you'd feel sympathy for the Trojans. It's just not a story that you can make into your kind of standard sword and sandal fantasy epic. I do think that the Iliad, just the Iliad, if you do it right, could be made into a good film. Because the focus of the story isn't about the Greeks versus Trojans. The focus of the story would be the conflict in the Greek camp. The conflict of the egos between Agamemnon and Achilles. And also the parallel quarreling of the gods that's going on in Olympus during this time. The problem with that, though, is that the Iliad deals with only a few months during the 10-year war. And it doesn't have the beginning of the war, the ending of the war. So that's asking a lot of your modern theater-going audiences, movie theater-going audiences, to just kind of be dropped in the middle of the story and then finish without a conclusion. At the time I wrote this, they were doing the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So I wrote, if Tolkien's works get turned into a trilogy, then probably Troy should have been made into a trilogy. I mean, there's more than enough material to do it. You could have one movie just on the start of the Trojan War, kind of one movie just narrating the events of the Iliad, and then one movie kind of the conclusion of the Trojan War. But I'll wait and see what happens with the new movie. Okay, now this is the second post after I had seen the movie Troy. Oh yeah, when I was in Nagasaki last weekend, I saw Troy, which is just opening now in Japan. I'd previously written that as someone who loves the original Greek myth, I was worried about what the movie would do to the story. Now, I'm somewhat tempted to go into heavy-duty geek mode here and just list everything that was wrong with the movie. But I'll refrain. For one thing, I've been on Rotten Tomatoes kind of reading some of the other reviews already published. And it looks like just about every other critic in the world is kind of going through and talking about how this movie deviates from the original Greek myth. Secondly, there's just too much stuff to get into. I mean, if you were to get into everything that was different from the Greek myth, you'd be kind of listing stuff all day. They completely just wrote out the gods and goddesses out of the movie, right? Which means everything in the original myth that happened between a god and a goddess, because of a god and a goddess, had to be explained differently in the movie. And then who lived and who died was different in the movie and the myth. And even when it wasn't, even when a character did die in both the movie and the myth, then when they died or how they died was wrong. Some of my favorite characters from the Trojan War, the original myth, didn't even appear in the movie. And thirdly, what do you expect from a two-hour Hollywood movie? I mean, they only had 2 hours. They couldn't have been faithful to the original myth, even if they wanted to. There's just way too much material. So, I'll just talk about the stuff I liked. Much to my pleasant surprise, I thought the movie did a good job of staying true to the flavor of the myth. I mean, they changed all the details, but I thought the original essence of it was there. Most of the characters were kind of as I always had pictured them. The movie kind of got their personalities right, even if it changed the details of the narrative. The movie also resisted the temptation to make Achilles into some sort of whitewashed hero, some sort of good guy. They showed him with many of the same faults and egos and motivations that he had back in the original Greek myth. Agamemnon's character as well seemed to me very similar to the way Agamemnon was always portrayed in the Iliad. And like the original Greek myth, the movie also made an attempt to show both the Greeks and the Trojans as sympathetic at different times. So, I thought that it was at least staying true to the essence of the original myth. Now, whether this works as a summer blockbuster epic fantasy sword and sandal movie, well, that's another question. But at least I thought they were making an effort.